Hello everyone and welcome to Going Global, a legal podcast for today's global challenges. This podcast is a collaborative initiative between São Paulo State University, Unesp, and Newcastle University. This podcast series comprehends 3 episodes that will explore extractivism as a global issue. This is episode 2, Posthumanism as a new standard for responsible extractivism. It was hosted by the Newcastle University students Emma Bickers and Aliya, and the Unesp students Raquel Freitas Colaço and Nobre Fernandes da Silva. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Emily Jones, a NUAcT Fellow and lecturer at Newcastle Law School. Please join us as the hosts and the guests present themselves and engage on the questions over today's global issues.
My name is Aliya, first year global law student at Newcastle, and I'm very interested in commercial law.
Hi, I'm Emma, and I'm a first year law student at Newcastle. I'm not sure about what I want to study yet.
Hi guys, I'm Raquel. I'm a third year law student at Unesp.
Hi guys, I'm Daniel. I'm the third law student at Unesp.
And then we're with Emily today. So firstly, Emily Jones, Dr. Emily Jones. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying law and why you chose to study law?
Sure, yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be with you all today. So thanks for inviting me on. So I work at Newcastle Law School, and I am an international lawyer and an environmental lawyer for the most part. And I've also done a lot of work on kind of feminist and queer approaches and post-human approaches, which we can talk about a bit if we want to, and what that even means. But yeah, just in terms of how I got to study law. So I remember when I was choosing my A-levels, which is what you do in the UK when you're like 16, I was kind of like, do I do science or do I do like more humanities things? And I decided to do more humanities subjects, just because it was a very hard choice at that age. Feels like you're choosing your entire life, doesn't it? And it's like, what? But yeah, so I decided to do those subjects, and I did law A-level, and I actually really loved it, which I didn't expect at all. It was like the last one that I chose kind of last minute because I didn't know what else to do. So yeah, that's why I decided to do a law degree. And yeah, I guess over time, I've kind of explored different areas of law. I started off thinking I would be a human rights lawyer, and I have done some human rights work. But yeah, I've kind of taken some different pathways as well. So yeah.
Very interesting. We're just gonna, for the listeners, like, what is posthumanism and ethical extractivism?
Yeah, so post-human theory actually comes from the humanities, mostly from kind of philosophy or cultural studies. And it's kind of used in different ways by different people, but I kind of use the more feminist-inspired vision of post-human theory, which that basically seeks to dismantle hierarchies between humans, so gender, race, class, disability, in the way that most intersectional feminist theory does. But it also challenges another hierarchy, which is that of the human over the non-human. So that can be in relation to non-human animals, the environment itself, and also thinking about technology as well. So yeah, I kind of try and bring these theories from the humanities into law.
Can I ask, Emily, why do you think learning and discussing topics like posthumanism are so important in our world today?
Yeah, I guess there are a few different ways that it's really important. I suppose in terms of right now in this very moment, like we're facing environmental crises in many different ways. Technological innovation is also, really changing the way that we live our lives and the way that we think about law. But also social inequalities are also really, getting more and more exasperated at the moment, like things are not good in the world, right? So I think, post-human theory can allow us to think about those things, but also to think about them together, which I think doesn't happen often enough. Like people often tend to be in silos, but what happens when we actually do think about these things is interconnected in some way.
We're going to move on to our questions to do with posthumanism and international law.
Daniel, would you like to start us off?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Emily, you mentioned in critical review of international law's green agenda that state sovereignty often acts as a legal shield that authorizes environment destruction through extractivism. In the context of the green agenda, do you believe that international law can truly regulate global supply chain and extraction without first dismantling the anthropocentric sovereign that prioritizes state-led wealth over ecological survival?
Wow, that is such a huge question. Gosh, yeah, I guess there are kind of a few different things here. Maybe the first thing to start off with would be the kind of critique of environmental law as like, basically, you think of environmental law as like, oh, it's there to protect the environment, it's a good thing. But actually, a lot of critical environmental law scholars have shown how environmental law in the end kind of just allows for extraction. It claims it's more sustainable, but so we can extract so far, but it needs to be, this is this idea of sustainable development, right? That it doesn't stop extraction altogether. So, what is environmental law actually doing? Is it protecting the environment, or is it just making things slightly greener, and the continuation of a kind of capitalist extractivist system? So yeah, the question of sovereignty and how that comes in, I mean, that's really huge. I think, the sovereign state obviously is really challenging from this perspective. Sovereignty, because states also, I mean, in international law, everything is about state consent. So getting new agreements is really difficult. By the time things are negotiated, they become so watered down to represent everyone's interests that they're not necessarily going to be like the strongest environmental agreements. But yeah, I guess whether we can have a kind of post-anthropocentric legal system with the state, I mean, I'm not really sure. I think it's difficult to imagine, but we have to have some hope because that's also the system that we have, and there are lots of people that are pushing towards this. So yeah, that sort of answers your question, I think.
Moving on to my question, one of your articles to do with ecocide critiques the anthropocentric foundations of international law. From a post-humanist perspective, can a legal system that is fundamentally human-centered ever meaningfully protect ecosystems while still permitting extractive economic activity?
Yeah, again, another huge question. I think, a lot of my work has looked at how the law is fundamentally set up around human interests and primarily elite human interests. So basically, international environmental law, for example, if we're talking about extractivism, well, who's that benefiting? It's like mostly rich, wealthy, white people in the global north, right? And obviously there are differences to that as well. But yeah, that's kind of the human-centered notion of environmental law. In terms of like how we can kind of challenge that, it's difficult to imagine. I mean, the legal system itself is so much set up around human interests and needs that short of like completely changing the system, it does feel very difficult to imagine beyond that. But there are kind of instances where people are trying to. So I guess like the kind of rights in nature movement is one example of that. So what happens where nature and non-human animals actually have rights and have legal personhood. So yeah, I guess there's these kind of, I always think of it in terms of, in feminist approaches to international law, we talk about resistance and compliance, which is this idea that like we need to like resist the system and try and think of completely different ways of thinking about what law even is. But at the same time, like how, compliance can be working within the system for more incremental change. And I guess we kind of need both in a way.
Perfect, thank you. Our next set of questions are about posthumanism and to do with hope, as obviously it's quite a hard subject when a lot of academics are quite negative. So the implications of posthumanism also raises issues of quite hard-hitting and controversial topics such as forced sterilisation and heteronormative ideology. Firstly, why does it do that, and why does posthumanism bring up these sort of topics in that sense?
Yeah, I think the reason that posthumanism does this is because it also has that focus on inequalities between humans. That really has to be at the fore. So I think it's really important to not just say, oh, I don't know, nature has rights, and then therefore we prioritize the rights of a river over human rights as well. So, and I think that there's a risk that that could happen. So it's really centering those inequalities at the same time as thinking about environment, technology, etc.
Yeah, and so therefore, do you find it quite hard to balance the utopia with limitations of the world?
Oh, so again, that's a very difficult question. Yeah, I guess, I mean, right now, the world feels pretty messed up, right? I mean, if we look at the conflict in the Middle East, we look at the environment, the environmental destruction of those military actions is,
It's hard to find hope, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very hard to find hope. But I guess one of the reasons why I think about hope in my work, I mean, post-human theory and post-human feminism, particularly in the work of someone like Rosie Braidotti, she talks about how affirmation is really important. So we have to have hope because, it's so easy to just kind of collapse into nihilism and be like, everything is messed up and there's nothing we can do about it. But like, that's also doesn't change anything. So I think keeping that kind of hope and, a utopia is kind of a big word. I like to see it as like, how can we like incrementally change things to reach towards a world that we maybe would prefer to live in? And I guess that's how I see my role. I don't really get much out of just critiquing everything and then mic dropping,
Yeah, thank you. I think our next set of questions are of rights of nature, and in terms of nature, Daniel, your question links into this.
So, Emily, in terms of the right of nature, there has recently been, again, in your work, you critique the universalization nature of human rights when applying to the environment. From a post-human perspective, how can international law move away from granting rights to nature as if it were a human-like subject, and instead embrace a relation approach that recognizes our reciprocal responsibilities toward ecosystem?
Yeah, great. I guess there's kind of two parts to that question. So starting off with the universal. So yeah, in that article, we kind of talk about, well, rights of nature is an emerging global movement. There's like more than 40 provisions in lots of different countries in every continent in the world at this stage. So, but to actually protect the rights of nature properly, it probably needs to be an international law because, it's fine and well to protect a river in a particular place, but like, how does this actually have a global effect? So in that article, we kind of question like, well, what would that mean? And yeah, one of the critiques that we make is, well, but part of the power of the rights of nature has been that it's so connected to place. So I guess the rights of nature also developed through indigenous worldviews primarily and cosmovisions. And so those kind of cosmovisions are so connected to place, and like those frameworks have been developed in that way that that's what's made it meaningful. So if you transpose that into the kind of global level, there's a risk that you actually lose some of the kind of meaning of that. So what we talk about in the article is actually like maybe in some ways it's not about putting it into international law, it's about kind of thinking about these things in a more transnational way. So how can we have rights of nature provisions in one place and that conversation can still speak to another place, and thinking about those connections in different ways. I guess the second part of the question was about rights and thinking about the individualistic notion of rights. So yeah, international human rights law has tended to focus on rights in terms of like an individual has a right to something. It's not generally been very good at thinking about more collective rights or rights beyond that framing. And I guess when we're thinking about nature, like it's very hard to think of nature as like an individual kind of entity in that same way. A river is connected to the land around it, to the non-human animals that are within it, to the people that live along the river. So I think one of the potentials that the rights of nature movement does have, and which possibly hasn't been explored quite enough yet in the literature, is how can we rethink the whole framing of rights? So can we actually start thinking about rights in a much more relational way? So that could be, thinking about all of those different entities that are connected to the river, but also about human and non-human relationality as well, and those connections between. Because, like I said, it's, you could say a river has rights, but if you start prioritizing those rights over human rights, that's also not very good. So how can we think about those in a kind of much more interconnected, holistic way?
I suppose my question moves on from that of like, how is the law evolving with your ideas after the judgment of the new, and excuse my pronunciation on this, but the Kilmer-Senior-Rinnan European Convention of Human Rights case?
Yeah, I mean, I also cannot pronounce that case. So you did a very good job as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, so that case, I mean, there's a lot of climate litigation cases that are ongoing. Like climate litigation has become a big thing, right? And particularly often led by youth groups. So this case is interesting because it was actually older women in Switzerland that brought the case. But what I think is very interesting about that case in terms of the European system of human rights is that it embeds this notion of intergenerational justice into the law. So they haven't quite recognized, the rights of future generations, for example, or the rights of particular groups in quite the same way. But they've said there is this notion of intergenerational justice. We need to think about this across generations. And I think that that's a really important move. And it gives lawyers and other people kind of scope to push the law a bit further moving forward.
Perfect. I think next set of questions is about extractivism and how you link that to anthropocentric and posthumanism. I think, Raquel, you've got the first question on that.
Yes. So you've also worked with extraction. So to provide some context for the following questions, what would be your definition or the one you find most accurate for sustainable extractivism?
I guess I've kind of worked on extractivism in some ways, but kind of not necessarily in like tons of detail, more as a kind of thinking about that as an idea within environmental law. I think this relates back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of sustainable development, which is kind of in many ways the underpinning concept of all international environmental law. Like everything is supposed to be based on that. But what I talk about in my work, and others have also talked about this, is how in the end it's basically saying that development, which is in the end often extraction, just needs to be a bit more sustainable. So in the end, it's kind of not saying that the environment should be protected. It's actually just saying, how do we do this in a way that isn't horrifically bad? And, if we look at how things have developed over the past few decades, since we kind of really embedded the principle of sustainable development into the law, I mean, we are seeing mass extraction and pollution and all of these things. So it kind of questions what that actually means.
Yes, thank you. So now related to your article on the governance of deep sea mining and the International Seabed Authority, you addressed the issue of international jurisdiction, and something that was really curious to me that was brought up in the article was about how the profits from the extracted resources could be divided, because in theory, the resources in the area belong to all humankind, right? What is your view on the capacity of international law to make this division?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So maybe just to explain that for everybody so that people understand. So there are some kind of parts of the world that are international territory. So one of those areas is the sea, basically. So up to kind of 12 nautical miles from the border of a state, that's part of a state's jurisdiction. So it's part of their territory. And then there's like this bit in between where they have economic access rights. And then the rest is like international waters that's owned by everyone. And this is really interesting in the context of deep sea mining, because if this mining is going to be happening in areas that are beyond national jurisdiction, is what we call it, so areas that are not owned by one state at all, then who gets to profit from that? And the interesting idea that they've kind of embedded into the law around this, and this actually came from the lobbying primarily of global South states during the time that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was negotiated. But basically they said, we want all of those profits to be shared equally. It can't just be like, an American company goes in, extracts these things from international waters, and then they make all of the money. Like, that's not fair. So they embedded this idea of the common heritage of humankind into the law. So, and it's interesting because when you hear the idea of common heritage of humankind, I think a lot of people think that that means environmental protection. Like, we just need to protect our common heritage, which is the ocean. But actually, it does become a kind of what we call in law the equitable benefit sharing mechanism. So how do we actually share those profits, those benefits across countries? In terms of whether that will actually happen, that's a really difficult thing to imagine in some ways. I mean, there is that provision in the law, and states are pushing for that to make sure that it does happen. I mean, there's a wider question of whether we should actually be mining the deep sea anyway, and if anyone should be making profit from that as well. So I guess that kind of underpins that whole conversation. But hopefully that answers your question.
So my final question comes from living in a country that was colonized and seeing it suffer the consequences of that to this day. Therefore, how could we ensure that the economic transition to sustainable extractivism does not repeat the same cycles of colonial exploitation in the global South?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably better positioned to also answer that than me in many ways, but that is kind of one of the main questions, isn't it? Yeah, again, we come down to also what's practical in terms of actually doing things to make this happen versus a kind of more utopic vision. But I think that thinking about reparations is really important in this context. So there's a lot of like emerging literature around and kind of activism around, yeah, kind of colonial reparations. Like, how can we actually pay colonial reparations for the damage that was done? And, you know, colonialism was about both exploitation of peoples and their environments. So how do we kind of conceptualize that and create a more equal world? But yeah, how do we actually kind of not repeat these things? I mean, there's always in environmental law this sense that we need to make sure that it's common but differentiated need, right? This idea that global South states maybe have more need for extraction because they're still kind of economically dependent on those things. And how do we account for that? I don't know, I guess overall it feels pretty hard to reimagine those power dynamics in the kind of global capitalist system because, you know, the problems that we're left with from colonialism is also just the wealth inequality. So yeah, it's not really an answer, just kind of more ideas that I'm throwing at you.
So I'm going to split my questions into two because I feel like we've like thrown quite heavy questions at you. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
But like, do you personally think that sustainable extractivism and economic growth and ecological protection can all coexist together?
Gosh. Yeah, I mean, personally, I can't really imagine a kind of sustainable system within global capitalism. It just doesn't. I feel like those things just don't work together. There are kind of different perspectives on this. There's a big movement around degrowth that's happening, which I find really interesting. So how can we actually, yeah, not base our economic systems around growth, but actually think about not growing so much? There have been critiques of that from the global South, however, saying like that's a kind of, you know, the people in the global North need degrowth because they're the ones that are using all the resources, but like that's actually not happening here. So yeah, again, I think that it's about kind of challenging the consumption and kind of profit making and capitalism, particularly within those global North states in the end.
And then linking into my next question, do you think a post-humanist perspective fundamentally challenges that premise by rejecting the idea that nature exists primarily for human use?
Yeah, I guess those things are really linked, right? Like the idea that nature is just for human benefit and the idea of kind of extractivism and those capitalist models, that is just those paradigms are so inherently linked. And this is why I think posthumanism is so useful because it does allow us to think about those things together. Like how is kind of capitalism and anthropocentrism inherently linked? So yeah.
Moving forward, one last question I had was, do you think as young society members we are today, anything we can do personally to help this movement?
Gosh, I mean, I think, yeah, it must be really difficult to be like a younger person in this current world, like, and just finding what your role is and what you want to do. But I guess I would just say, like, there are so many different kind of causes that you could be involved in, and I just think you need to follow, like, what's the thing that you're really passionate about and that you really want to invest your time and energy in, because, you know, whether you're doing kind of more activism or you're doing kind of more academic legal scholarship or you're acting as a lawyer, like all of these things take so much time. So you kind of need to decide like what's the thing that you are really passionate about investing in. But I would say definitely don't give up hope. Like I think, you know, and your generation, broadly conceived, the generation below mine, I guess, or a few below mine. I think, you know, there are some really like there's a lot of people are kind of thinking about things differently. Like I have a friend who does research, Catherine Walker, who's at Newcastle as well, on like youth groups and how for them it's just inherent that like non-human animals and entities also should have rights and are beings, right? Like that's just obvious. But like that isn't to older people necessarily. So like I think the fact that you guys have those perspectives and, you know, different perspective on colonialism and on racism and are more fluent in kind of feminist ideas than my generation certainly was at your age, I think that's really cool. And like that gives me a lot of hope for the world. So I think just keep it up, find the things that you're really passionate about. And I think that you could definitely all make a difference.
Hopefully.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. We've talked about some really interesting topics that I'll definitely be using when I've been thinking about my academic research. So thank you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for also reading my work in so much depth and asking such great questions that were challenging. So you did a great job.